Yom Tov, and welcome to our second session of Minutes of Midrash. And I'd like to begin with Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman, of course, is the warrior princess of the Amazons. She's a mythological figure. She represents the embodiment of going to battle for righteousness and goodness and justice. And we actually have that same sort of image, but just not quite as attractive. All right, so what I'm going to be doing with the Midrash today is I'm going to be talking about how Midrash helps adjust our understanding and how we think about what the Bible says and how it expresses itself. So I'm going to begin with an observation you may have noticed or you may not have noticed in your exposure to the Bible. And that is that there's a lot of images of God as a warrior in the Torah and elsewhere. Probably the most famous place is actually as the Israelites are being brought out of Egypt and they've gotten to the Sea of Reeds, and the waters open and allow us to cross. And then when the Egyptians try and cross, the waters roll back in, destroy the Egyptian army. Moses sings a victory song. I guess the ancient Israelites would sing victory songs when a military success occurred. We have other examples of it in the Bible. In any case, he begins with the line, Adonai, Adonai is a man of war. That's not the way we like to think about God. We don't think about God as a warrior, but our ancestors did. And the reason is really sociological. You know, the Israelites lived in a tribal Iron Age society. Tribes warred against tribes on a regular basis. It's not just that the world was full of violence, the world was full of war. And any Israelite could anticipate at least once, maybe several times in their life, that war would actually wash over their communities. And I don't mean happening at a distance the way we experience war. I mean like Midianites showing up at the gates of their farms and pillaging and raping and carrying off slaves. So the Israelites knew war on a personal basis. They feared it. They fought in it. And what did they want from their God? They wanted God to be their protector. They wanted God to fight for them. And therefore, they often imagined the God of Israel as a warrior. And in fact, the term used in biblical studies is the divine warrior image. It's very commonplace in the Bible, though we're very uncomfortable with it now. Why? Because our needs and therefore our expectations for God have changed. I think of a short story I read, it must be 40 years ago, and I don't even think I could find it. It's about two teachers. One of them is Jewish, one of them is Christian. And the Christian keeps poking, the Jew about this and that and this and that. And at one point, it's a great moment in the story. The Christian says, "I have no use for the God of wrath, the God of the Old Testament," as if that is all that God is in the Old Testament. But I don't get it. My God is a God of compassion and love and caring, etc., etc. And the Jewish character, rather drolly, just says back to him, "I don't know. If I'm about to be marched into a gas chamber, the thought of a God of wrath would be pretty comforting to me." So we need a different aspect of God. We need a different experience of God. Or as the pagans would say, you might call on a different God under different conditions. In some conditions, you might need a God of justice. In another, you might need a God of war. Maybe you need a goddess of love. We, in our claim to monotheism, that revolutionary idea that we find in the Bible, says that all of those things are embodied in God. And here is a Midrash that is written about that very thing. Now, how is this updating? This is updating in the sense that the rabbis who composed this one probably were writing it somewhere between the 1st and 3rd century CE, that is, during the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire represented a completely different experience than the biblical experience, because the Roman Empire enforced peace for the most part. Yeah, we know about Romans and all their wars and the Jewish war and the Jewish revolt and all that sort of thing. But as a general rule, on a day-to-day basis, what the Romans did was they gave what was called the Pax Romani, the Roman peace. They forced the many societies under their empire to coexist. They learned the tolerance, the ordeal of tolerance through the Romans. And for that reason, because of the social context, I think that's why Christianity and Jesus really emphasized the idea of a universal peace and a universal world, because they saw it. They could imagine what it might be like. And our rabbis, too, understood that the warrior image of God in the Bible was perhaps not as useful in their own context as it was to their ancestors. And so we're going to look at a Midrash called Mechilta de Rabi Ishmael. This is one that I forgot to bring a copy of it with me. It sits at home. It is, in fact, we think, the oldest Midrash collection in existence. And it is probably finally edited together by the 3rd century. It probably had been in process of collecting different homilies and different sermons and different interpretations of verses for about a century or more. And but this embodies the kind of thinking that was going on among religious Jews in the time of the Romans. All right. And it's a curious book because it is devoted entirely to the book of Exodus, but it only starts Exodus at Exodus 12, right? Chapter 12. Well, what's going on in Exodus chapter 12? Chapter 12 is the first place that God gives a mitzvah to the Israelites as a community. There have been individual mitzvot that have appeared for humanity in general. So we have, be fruitful and multiply in Genesis. We also have the command not to murder. All that applies to all of humanity. But we get our first particularly Jewish or Israelite mitzvah in chapter 12, which is to remember the Exodus, basically the command to observe the Seder. And so this is the beginning of the Jewish story, as far as the author of Mechilta de Rabi Ishmael is concerned. He thinks that this is where the Jewish story starts. It's a reasonable location. By the way, I should say that even though it's called Mechilta de Rabi Ishmael, the sections of Rabbi Ishmael, that doesn't mean that Rabbi Ishmael of the Talmud is the author of the entire collection. He's the first rabbi mentioned in the collection, and so it may be that his name simply gets assigned to it. These books are all anthologies. They're all the work of many rabbis talking at different times over the course of the composition of the book. So it's a best hits of the latter chapters of Exodus. And so we're going to look at one that is focusing on this idea of God as the warrior. So let's go ahead and look at our screen share. Let's see, that should be, is that this one? Let's open that and find out. Yes, all right. So we're going to look at this archaic not so useful to us image of God as a man of war and see how they try and guide us. They're really working on two issues here. One is that they are still the only monotheistic society in the world at Roman times. Most of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire are pagans or polytheists. The only exception to that is Zoroastrians in the Persian Empire. And remember, Jews live in both the Roman and Persian Empire, so they're encountering both these societies. And in the Zoroastrian worldview, the world is divided into two divinities, a good divinity and an evil divinity. So there are two powers in the world, according to the Zoroastrians, and you'll see that come up here in just a little bit. All right, so Mechilta starts with the first issue, which is God a warrior god? Citing Exodus 15, the victory poem of Moses, it says, Adonai is a man of war, Adonai is his name. So this is a poetic structure in Israelite language. The first part of the stick is Adonai is a man of war. The second part is Adonai is his name. The repetition is very characteristic of Israelite poetry. Rabbi Yehuda says, this is a verse rich from what is written in many places. In other words, this idea reappears again and again, and he's about to cite it. Now, I actually shorten the number of citations because there are about double the number of citations in this Midrash from the ones here, but you'll get the point. He revealed himself, that is, God revealed himself to them, the Israelites, with a spear, as it is written in Habakkuk, by the light of the flash of your spear. And in Psalms, by and draw spear and don buckler, etc. He revealed himself to them with bow and arrows, Habakkuk. The nakedness of your bow will be revealed. And in 2 Samuel, and he sent forth arrows. He revealed himself with shield and buckler, as it says in the Psalms, shield and buckler is your truth. Take up buckler and shield. I might think, I might be misled. That's a standard midrashic phrase that also appears in the Talmud. I might erroneously think that he, that is God, because it is a masculine pronoun in the Midrash, sorry about that, required one of all these objects. In other words, God is like the pagan gods who have magical devices or iconic weapons. So we think obviously of Zeus with his lightning, or Athena with her sword and shield. More in the ancient Middle Eastern tradition, we think of the god Marduk, who would fight with lightning and a mace. So the idea that gods need magical devices or have magical devices is pretty commonplace in this world. But they don't want us to think that. I might think that he actually required one of these objects. It is therefore written, Adonai is a man of war. Adonai is his name. That second phrase is critical. It is his name with which he wars, and not with any of these objects. In other words, God doesn't literally go to war. He doesn't literally smite his enemies, but rather God's reputation, God's essence, God's values are the defense of Israel. These are the things that sustain us. All right. And it's not that God is literally going to come out of the clouds and smite the enemy armies, but that God, by his nature and by his teachings, his name, is going to help us out. So the first message is, don't literally expect God to show up and fight your battles for it. And actually, it's subtle, but I think it was intentional, that the last proof text they provide is the one where it quotes from Psalms, shield and buckler is your truth. I got his and your, is your truth. And take up buckler and shield. So even in the Psalms, it's already saying that the buckler and shield are not a literal object. They are representation of an essential value of God, which is truth. And so that already telegraphs to us the message at the end of the Midrash, which is that God's weapons of war is his name, his very essence. So now we've sort of, the rabbis have denatured a little bit the warrior image of God. But that doesn't mean we don't need that image. And the next part is going to take us through some of that. So let me come back to myself here for a moment so you can smile upon my lovely Punim. And I'm going to make a little adjustment here. All right. And well, maybe not. Maybe I have to do it when it's up. All right. So now let's see if we can go down on this page. Yes, here we go. We're going down. All right. So now they're going to pick up and continue with something that might be really relevant to us. We've already declared that God is not literally a man of war, but God can function in that kind of capacity for us when we need it. God is a man of war. What is the intent of this? Asks the Midrash. Because he revealed himself at the sea as a hero waging war, Adonai is a man of war. But, and I don't think this is and, I'm using the translation they gave me, the particle vav in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew and early Hebrew, can mean both and or but. And I think the Midrash means you should also understand but. There's other ways to think of God. And he revealed himself as at Sinai as an elder full of mercy. And they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet was the work of a sapphire brick, as the appearance of heavens in brightness. Now, how does that make God a God of mercy? No mention of mercy in there. Well, the mercy is, we hear from other parts of the Hebrew Bible that you can't see God and live. But here, Moses and Aaron's sons, and the elders of Israel actually get a vision of God. And because of that, they learn that God is a merciful God. Moreover, this is happening at Sinai. So the God that the Israelites have encountered at Sinai is not a warrior God. He's a law-giving God. He is a God of justice. So now the Israelite God fulfills the functions of two gods in a pagan system. He is both a God of war, but also a God of justice, and also a God of mercy or compassion. So he's a threefer. Our God is a threefer. They need three gods to fulfill these functions in the world, but we only need one. But then it goes on to cite a third verse, Daniel 7:9. I watched as thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days sat. All right. Now, the Ancient of Days is a very odd phrase, but it's probably pretty clearly referring to a notion of God. And the image that goes on to describe is an old man with a white beard. Our classic image, the image that Michelangelo painted on the Sistine Chapel, the old man with a white beard. All right. That is enshrined in the Jewish source material as the old man who was about to deliver Israel from exile in Babylon. Now, this image of God is not a warrior God. He's not going to bring us out by war. He's going to bring us out by reason. And it is, in fact, that the exile ended because the king of Persia, Cyrus the Great, made a decree that the Jews should be able to return to their land. So it wasn't like the exile in Egypt where God had to force our freedom, but rather an act of justice and compassion yielded Cyrus's decision, and therefore Daniel understands that it is a God of justness and fairness an old man sitting on a throne who triggers all of this. All right? So understand what we've gotten here. What we've gotten is at least 3 different images of God, very different, each one of them, all of them appearing in different parts of the Bible. And therefore, for us, or for the rabbis living in a pagan environment, but also wanting to communicate the importance of the one universal God who ties everything together, is showing us, oh, look, we get all the gods that these guys get. But it comes in a single fantastic package. God is like a Swiss Army knife of gods. He does it all right? Our God is more awesome than all their gods put together. All right. And then this is where we sort of bring the Zoroastrians into the conversation. And his summary of these 3 different verses is, so as not to give a pretext to the people of the world to say there are 2 deities, or perhaps a minimum of 2 deities, right? So that's a dig at Zoroastrianism. Don't tell me that there's a good God and an evil God. Don't tell me that there's more than 2 gods. I know that there's only one God because I read the Hebrew Bible. As it is written, Adonai is a man of war. Adonai is his name. Now, there should be quotation marks at the end of that. Sorry that. And then the Midrash goes on to say, it was God, it was he, terrible he pronoun, it was God upon the sea, God in Egypt, God in the past, God in the future, God in time to come, God in this world, God in the world to come. As it is written in the book of Deuteronomy, or Devarim in Hebrew, see now that it is I, and there is no God with me. In addition, an additional proof text from Isaiah 41, who wrought and did, who worked and did, the caller of the generations into the being from the beginning. I, Adonai, was the first to perform wonders and help, and it is I who will be with you at the end, or in later generations. There is a warrior at the height of his power. That's the first image of God that we've seen. 40 years old. I guess their warriors were a little older than ours. It suggests some maturity. Who is not like a 60-year-old, which is meant to be the second image of the merciful God at Sinai, nor a 60-year-old like a 70-year-old, like an old man sitting in his chair. But the older he grows, the more his power wanes. In other words, a human being goes from strength to weakness, but not our God. Not so he who spoke and brought the world into being. I am Adonai, I have not changed. So we may embrace the idea that God fights for us. We may embrace the image of God as a merciful God. We may embrace the image as a God of justice and fairness. It's all the same God. It's all the same essential ground of being. It's not that the world is fragmented. It's not that the world is broken up into domains, this versus that, but all of it is actually seamless. It all ties together. It all ultimately makes sense, even with these competing values, because there is one God. And this Midrash takes a very archaic feature of the Hebrew Bible and its description of God, the divine warrior, and uses it as a building block to build a more sophisticated notion of what it means to serve one God. And it's implying what's superior about one God over many gods. So I hope this also helps you appreciate Midrash. You see this extra feature that we saw, the use of many different proof texts from different parts of the Bible. This is called, and this is a term coined for Midrash, is intertextuality. That one of the features of Midrash is it pulls together diverse passages from the Bible and says they're actually communicating with each other. They're actually informing each other, that we can understand one verse by examining another verse. And even better, if we can bring together 3 or 4 verses that seem to not necessarily be speaking about the same thing, they're going to reveal an even greater whole. So again, going back to our first lesson, we learn that all of the Bible is divine. It is talking to us simultaneously, and that we shouldn't just, even though the Midrash does isolate ideas and isolate verses and words, ultimately the whole thing is seamless. It is a great cosmic fabric, all woven together, of unsurpassed beauty. That's our Torah. So that's our second session in Minutes of Midrash, and I thank you for participating. Wonder Woman thanks you for participating, and we'll talk to you again soon.